Hello, Mr Hardy here, and in this video I would like to teach you about Chapter 2 of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, called Search for Mr Hyde. I'll start by explaining what happens in this chapter. We'll then explore the key characters, context, themes and quotes you may want to commit to memory ahead of an assessment, and I'll leave you with an exam style question you can answer if you want to get some analytical writing practice in. So, what happens in Chapter 2 of Stevenson's novella? Mr Utterson, after his dinner, opens Dr Jekyll's will. Now, a will is a legal document that you leave behind upon your passing, so upon your death. A lawyer will then execute the will, so you can decide who to leave your money to, your house to, your car to, etc. Dr Jekyll's will states that if Jekyll dies, everything he owns passes over to Mr Hyde. Or, if Jekyll disappears for a period of more than 3 months, then everything also passes to Mr Hyde. Now, this is quite unusual. Normally the will is left to your husband or wife or maybe children. So to leave it to a stranger, or maybe at the very best Jekyll and Hyde are maybe friends, it's an unusual thing to do. And this will infuriates Utterson, who's a very logical and reasonable man, because this is not a common will. This will doesn't make any sense. And now that Utterson has some knowledge about what sort of person Hyde is, he trampled over a girl, he's unpleasant, he gives off a sense of deformity, why would someone like Dr Jekyll, with a wonderful reputation, why would he leave all his possessions to someone with such a horrible reputation? So, Mr Utterson is set on investigating this further and adopts the role of the detective in this novella. So Utterson leaves for Cavendish Square, which is a place in London, to consult Dr Lanyon. For reference, in the Victorian era, Cavendish Square was quite an upmarket part of London, where a lot of medical professionals lived, so people like Dr Lanyon and Dr Jekyll. Soho, which is where we find Blackmail House, is only about 10 or 15 minutes walk from Cavendish Square. That's a bit more run down, a bit more down and dirty, a bit more criminal, and that's where we find Mr Hyde and his property of Blackmail House. So think about how the location has connotations with the people who live there and the theme of reputation. Cavendish Square is upmarket for medical professionals like Jekyll and Lanyon, whereas Blackmail House is in Soho, which is sort of down and dirty and criminal, and that's where you'd find Mr Hyde. So, we meet Dr Lanyon, and he is a healthy-looking man. This is important for later on in the novella, and he's a very welcoming man. He has a great personality. The reader learns that Utterson, Lanyon and Jekyll are all close old friends. However, recently Dr Lanyon has distanced himself from Dr Jekyll because of Dr Jekyll's unscientific boulder dash. So that means that Dr Lanyon practices a very regular, orthodox, traditional type of science, whereas Dr Jekyll's science is a bit more experimental, it's a bit more transcendental, it's a bit more unethical, maybe immoral. And because of that, these two friends have gone separate ways. Now, Dr Lanyon has not heard of Mr Hyde, so Mr Utterson takes his leave and returns home. As Mr Utterson sleeps, he has nightmares about Mr Hyde. He sees Mr Hyde trample over the girl calmly near Blackmail House. He even sees a figure sort of stand over him in his dreams in his sleep, and that figure is Mr Hyde. So, Mr Utterson believes if he meets Mr Hyde in the flesh, he could solve some of this mystery, or at the very least get rid of his nightmares. So he stakes out Blackmail House. I don't know if you've seen any Hollywood films where you have two cops in a car performing a stakeout where they wait at a property for a criminal to enter. So that's basically what Mr Utterson does. He waits outside Blackmail House day in, day out, waiting for Mr Hyde to appear. And one night he is rewarded. Mr Hyde returns to Blackmail House and Mr Utterson approaches him. Mr Hyde reveals his face to Utterson. After Utterson requested it, Utterson asked, "Can I see your face?" And at the same time, Mr Hyde provides an address in Soho, and this alarms Mr Utterson because it seems to link him to the will. Hyde accuses Utterson of lying. So Hyde asked Utterson, "How do you know about me?" And Utterson says, "Well, Dr. Jekyll told me about you." And Hyde says, "No, that's a lie." And he disappears inside of Blackmail House. So Mr. Utterson provides the reader with our second description of Mr. Hyde. Again, he highlights his grotesque appearance, the idea of him being sort of deformed and unappealing on the eye. And he also reveals his sense of evilness, so his personality or his aura is quite evil. Mr. Utterson then knocks at Dr. Jekyll's house. So he walks back to Cavendish Square, knocks at Dr. Jekyll's house, but Dr. Jekyll, according to his butler Poole, is not in. Utterson and Poole discuss Mr. Hyde. Hyde, it appears, has access to the dissecting room, but he never dines in Jekyll's house. So whilst Jekyll's house is in the reputable Cavendish Square, Jekyll's dissecting room is in Soho, is in Blackmail House. So Hyde lives in a disreputable building, whereas Jekyll lives in the reputable part of London. Utterson then leaves and returns home, and he feels an overwhelming concern for his friend, Dr. Henry Jekyll. So let's take a little look at the characters. Mr. Utterson, he's the detective in this novella, and he's also our narrator, so we get all the information through him. He shows concern for his friend Jekyll, so friendship is a theme in this novella, and he and Jekyll have good friendship. Utterson also shows disgust for Hyde, as everyone else does, and then as a result, as readers, we also feel a disgust for Hyde, because we tend to be quite close to our narrator as a reader. We briefly meet Dr. Lanyon. The key points about him is he's healthy and friendly, and that's important for later in the novella. Lanyon, Jekyll and Utterson are all close old friends. However, Lanyon and Jekyll have disagreed and parted ways because they practice different types of science. Dr. Lanyon's quite traditional and orthodox, whereas Dr. Jekyll is more transcendental and experimental, and as a result they've gone separate ways. Dr. Lanyon does not know anything about Mr. Hyde. So, we get Mr. Hyde. We see him for the first time in this chapter, and we get a good description of him from Mr. Utterson. Mr. Hyde haunts Mr. Utterson's nightmares, so he's a nightmarish figure. Mr. Hyde moves with an odd light footstep. That's important for later on in the novella. He doesn't walk with a normal stride, something irregular about the way he moves. Mr. Hyde shrank and was hissing when Mr. Utterson touched him. So shrank is maybe he lacks confidence. Hissing gives a snake-like quality, an evil quality. Mr. Hyde snarled and gave a savage laugh when talking to Utterson. So snarled is very animalistic, like baring teeth, being aggressive. Savage laugh, that adjective savage, wild, maybe like connotations of cannibalistic maybe, definitely unpleasant. Mr. Hyde is pale and dwarfish, so he's light in his skin complexion and he's short in his stature. And he gave an impression of deformity. So again, this word deformity is being used to describe Hyde. And we get a bit of his personality. We learn that he's a murderous mixture. This alliteration is quite easy to remember, and it suggests that he has violence in him, violence to the point of murder. Mr. Hyde appears troglodytic. Troglodytic means small cave-dwelling creature, a troglodyte. So by describing Hyde as troglodytic, it suggests he's maybe small, pale, more creature than he is human. And he appears to bear Satan's signature. This is another alliteration that's quite easy to remember. It's almost as if Satan has made him in hell, packaged him up and signed him and sort of dispatched him into the world. He's signed with evilness, he's signed with Satan's signature. So, contextually speaking, if you read this chapter in its entirety, there is reference to Dr. Jekyll and Dr. Lanyon being like Damon and Pythias. For those of you who don't know it, I'll recount the story to you to fill you in on some detail. So Damon and Pythias is a Greek story about a man called Pythias who plots treason to kill the king. And the king at the time was Dionysus. And he's caught and Pythias is sentenced to death. But before his execution date, Pythias asks to return home to settle his affairs, presumably to say goodbye to his parents, wife, kids, etc., before he is executed. Dionysus only agrees to let Pythias go when Damon, Pythias's friend, agrees to take Pythias's place in prison, and even on the execution site if need be, whether that's a beheading on the execution block or a hanging at the gallows. So Pythias returns home and Damon is locked up in prison on his behalf. The day of the execution draws nearer and nearer, and there is no sign of Pythias returning. But his friend Damon trusts his friend and would even die for his friend. He even says, if Pythias is late, I'm sure he has a legitimate reason, I will die on his behalf, which is unbelievable in many people's opinion. However, at the last minute on the execution site, just before Dionysus was about to execute Damon, Pythias appears, apologises, he was delayed by a storm, and takes Damon's place and thanks Damon. And Pythias gets ready to be executed. But Dionysus the king was so moved by this display of friendship, of philia, that he pardons both Pythias and Damon, and both friends live. So what this teaches us is that Dr. Jekyll and Dr. Lanyon were incredibly close, like Damon and Pythias, close as brothers. But now they've gone their separate ways, so clearly Dr. Lanyon feels that whatever sort of science Dr. Jekyll is performing is awful, it's hideous, and he doesn't want to have anything to do with it. So they were like brothers, but now they are estranged brothers. They don't know each other. So, thematically, the theme of science runs throughout this text. The information I'm going to give you here is, I guess, a bit more contextual, but it feeds into the theme. So, in the Victorian era, it was a largely Christian society, and they believed that God created the world. As per the Bible, with the 7 days, God created light, and then seas and land, and then animals and trees and birds, etc. So when Charles Darwin published his book Origins of the Species in 1859, it shook Victorian society, and it created a science versus religion divide, this same sort of divide that we have today. And science was developing really quickly in the Victorian era, so much so that wealthy gentlemen who were interested in science, who had science as their hobby, would even pay criminals to dig up freshly buried corpses so they could perform dissections and scientific experiments on them. Actually, the same writer of Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde, Robert Louis Stevenson, wrote a short story called The Body Snatcher, all about this. And this is what they were called, body snatchers, these criminals who dug up bodies, and gentlemen paid for them so they can develop their scientific knowledge. Anyway, Dr. Lanyon's science is what you could consider traditional, ethical, moral, orthodox science, in quote marks, good science. Whereas Jekyll's science is what you might call experimental or transcendental or immoral or unethical. It sort of pushes the boundaries, in quote marks, bad science. So the theme of science, whether it's considered good or bad, or the desire to develop science, or the idea of science versus religion, or science versus God, these are themes you can track throughout the entire novella. So, key quotes to take away from chapter 2. Dr. Lanyon is described as hearty, healthy, dapper, red-faced gentleman. Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. Dr. Lanyon says this about Jekyll's type of science. He even labels it unscientific balderdash. So that's a reference to Jekyll's transcendental science. Mr Hyde is described as a human juggernaut again. A quick refresher, juggernaut is a Hindu float that's used at festivals. It's big, it's massive, it's unstoppable. I really like this quote. If he be Mr Hyde, I shall be Mr Seek. A reference to hide and seek. And that firmly puts Utterson in the position of not just narrator but detective. He's going to seek out Mr Hyde and find the truth. Mr Hyde is described as walking with an odd light footstep. That's important for later on in the novella. And I've picked out some words that describe Hyde. He shrank, hissing, snarled, savage laugh. It gives him an animalistic or an evil quality. More quotes about Hyde that reveal his animalistic or evil nature: pale and dwarfish, murderous mixture, troglodytic, Satan's signature. Okay, you can make notes from this video on a physical copy of the novella. to help you with your revision. If you want some writing practice, you can try answering this question. How does Stevenson present Mr Hyde in Search for Mr Hyde? That's the name of chapter 2. We finally meet this character. How is he presented? Animalistic might be a point you want to make. Evil might be another point you want to make. Pick out a few quotes. Pick out some of those techniques, such as the alliteration or the textual reference with troglodytic. Explain to me how that proves, the quote proves that Mr Hyde is presented as animalistic or evil. And if you want to add in some contextual knowledge, feel free to do so as well for a well-rounded answer. I hope you found this video useful. Please give it a like if you did. Please consider subscribing to my channel for the rest of the Jekyll and Hyde analysis. And feel free to leave a comment if you think I missed anything out. Well, thank you for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.